The subject of this Perek, the fourth Perek, on the bottom of Daf Nunam and Aleph is Minhagim. And each place, each location has its own minhag. For example, with regard to Erev Pesach, the day of the 14th of Nisan is divided into two parts. From midday until Pesach, in other words, the minhag that the Mishnah here at the beginning of the fourth parak is referring to only relates to the morning of the 14th. As far as the afternoon of the 14th, from Chatzos and on, that's not Mishum Minhag. That's Asur b'Malacha. We don't do Malacha. We're talking about heavy kind of work, heavy duty work, from Chatzos and on. And if you take a look at Tosas Divir Maschel Makom, he quotes in the name of the Riva, a Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi says that from the time the Korban Pesach is brought, which means from Chatzos and on, that's a day of Korban. A day of Korban has the status of a day of Simcha, and we abstain from Malach. But the issue of Minhag relates to the morning of the 14th, up until Chatzos. And the Mishnah says, Makom SheNahagu lasos melacha bi'arvei psachim ad chatzos osim. It's perfectly legitimate that in certain locations they do melacha on Erev Pesach up until chatzos. And strictly according to the law, al pi din, it's mutter to do melacha in the morning of the 14th of Nisan. Now, from the fact that the Tana mentions the minhag up until Chatzos Hayom, the Gemara is going to understand, as we indicated earlier, that after Chatzos Hayom, the Isa Malachas Mikra Adin, it's absolute, it's not relative to any location. Everyone is enjoined from Malacha on Erev Pesach after Chatzos. But as far as the morning is concerned, there's a valid minhag to do Malacha that allows Malacha. Avali Olam Abba, I'm sorry, that's called Makom SheNahagu Lasos Malacha. But then there's Makom SheNahagu Shelo Lasos Malacha. There are those who accepted a minhag not to do Malacha in the morning of the 14th. And Rashi offers an explanation for this minhag, and that is that a person should not be tarud b'malachto. There's so much on his mind on Erev Pesach. For example, when the Mikdash stood, he would have to not only destroy his chametz on Erev Pesach, but he would also have to shecht his Korban Pesach. He would have to prepare matzah for the night of the Seder. That has nothing to do with the Beis HaMikdash. So the Isser and the Isser of chametz and the mitzvah of destroying chametz and the need to prepare matzah, this applies even when there's no Korban Pesach. And in order to guarantee that he be free, his time is free to dedicate himself to these very important matters in preparation for Pesach, he should abstain from malacha. That was the minhag of Ein Osin Malacha. And we're going to see later on that there's an urgency to eat the matzah as early as possible. So theoretically, you could bake the matzah on the night of Pesach, but that's going to delay your achilas matzah. And the Gemara is going to talk about the children. We want to get the children involved, and before they fall asleep, etc. In any event, we want to be free on Erev Pesach, according to this minhag, even in the morning, to dedicate ourselves to prepare for Pesach. And excuse me, as we said before, the reason why the Mishnah implies that after Chatzos it's asur mi ikar adin to engage in malacha. Tosas quotes in the name of the Yerushalmi, and that's because Karban Yachid Roy Lakrivo B'Tchilas Hayom, and therefore Nesar b'Malacha Miyad. Mashen came b'Korban Pesach, Eino Yochel Akrivo El Liachar Chatzos. So if we have halacha that on the day of a korban, it's like a yontif for us, and we abstain therefore from halacha, in the case of Erev Pesach, that only applies after Chatzos with regard to the Korban Pesach, because we cannot be making the Korban Pesach until after Chatzos. Gemara actually quotes this halacha at the beginning of Masechta Pesachim to indicate that a day in halacha could be split into two parts. Normally, a day in halacha is from daybreak until dusk, and it's one entity, call it 12 hours as a unit. But in the case of the 14th of Nisan, the Torah actually divides the day into two, because the Korban Pesach begins at Chatzos. In fact, according to most Rishonim, the Isur Chametz begins at Chatzos. And in the morning, as far as Torah law is concerned, there is no Isur Chametz. And there's no mitzvah to destroy your Chametz. It's all Chatzos, Ach Chilek. And that means Chilek, you take a unit of time and you divide it into two. I remember when we were learning that sugya, Rav Shechter quoted the Rav as saying that on Yom Kippur, we actually divide up Yom Kippur into two parts. There's the night of Yom Kippur and the day of Yom Kippur. But the truth is, there are precedents to divide the night from the day. For example, kindness in general, we split between the night and the day. And the mitzvah b'dikas chametz is only at night, not really during the day. I mean, there's a default. But to take the day itself and split it to before Chatzos and after Chatzos, that's unique to Yudalid B'Nisan. And the Makom SheNahagu Lasos Malacha, the second half of Yudalid B'Nisan from Chatzos and on becomes endowed with the Nisan Malacha, which is not true for the first half. And now the Mishnah addresses one of the most important issues in Minhagim that exists, and that is Haholech Mimakom L'Makom. So, for example, in my locality, we do malacha. We are involved in malacha in the morning of Erev Pesach. But I come to your town, and you locally have the minhag to abstain from malacha, or the reverse. Let's say in my locale, we have a malacha we have a minhag to abstain from malacha. Now I come to your neighborhood where they do malacha in the morning of Erev Pesach. And basically, they get you coming and going. And the Mishnah says, "Haholech mimakom she'osim lemakom she'einosim, or mimakom she'einosim lemakom she'osim, nosim olav chumrei makom she'yatzel misham, vechumrei makom she'holach l'sham." And what that means is that if I have a kula in my locale, but now I relocate myself in your locale, and it's a chumrah, I'm not allowed to be noig against the local minhag, the kula. That would create machlokas. And on the flip side, if I come from a locale where they're noig l'chumrah, I have to maintain that minhag even when I show up in your locale where they don't have that chumrah, because there are two machayvim in minhag. There's one machayv in minhag, which is the makom itself, and there's another machayv minhag in the gavra, the person, which means that once there's a minhag, then the location itself generates a chumrah. So, for example, if let's say in Katamon on Erev Pesach, they don't do malach in the morning, that engenders an Isur in Katamon. And therefore, anyone who shows up in Katamon is obliged, is enjoined by virtue of that minhag. But then there's another halacha minhag, which is not makom, but the individual. The makom, in a sense, ricochets or rebounds onto each individual, and the makom generates a chovas yachid that each individual is obligated to accept that minhag. And therefore, wherever he is on the face of the earth, he has accepted that chumrah, unless he cuts himself off from his original location. Meaning, as far as the Machayev of Makom, that's Liolam Vod. There are no conditions and the situation doesn't change. But as far as the Machayev of the Gavra is concerned, he's only carrying that Chumrah with him wherever he goes because of his connection to his original Makom. If he cuts off that connection, then the Chovas Gavra of the Minhag is completely Paka. Why? Because the Machayev of the Chovas Gavra is the connection, shall we say, the intention of the person to return to his Makom. Once he severs his connection to the Makom, then the Minhag is no longer Machayev him, unless he finds himself in another Makom that has the same Minhag. So that you may find, let's say, a German Jew finds himself in Holland, or a Dutch Jew finds himself in Germany. A German Jew finds himself in Poland, and it goes on and on. How long do you wait between fleischiks and milchiks? You ate meat, now you want to eat milk. You want to eat milk. So there are various minhagim, as you know. You know, the Dutch will wait an hour, and the Germans will wait 3 hours. Some Germans only wait 1 hour, and then you'll have the Polish, and the Polish will wait 6 hours. My father told me he came from an area in Lithuania where they only waited 4 hours. Well, excuse me, 5 hours. 5 hours and a mashu. They went a little bit into the 6th hour. I mean, there are so many different minhagim. And l'chumra, unfortunately, you're going to carry your minhag wherever you go. So you might be a Polish Jew visiting Holland, and you'll have to observe the minhag of Poland, and you'll have to wait a full 6 hours. If, on the other hand, you're a Dutch Jew, but you find yourself in Poland, then you should be waiting 6 hours. Now, the question is why that's not so, and why is that the exception to the rule? So that might have to do with the public nature of the minhag. And that's one of the things the sugya is going to address. Maybe malacha has a certain public sound to it. Although today you can lock yourself up in a room and you can play with the computer, make no noise whatsoever. And the poskim actually address those issues, whether or not the minhag makom is mechayev you if you lock yourself up in a room and you don't make any noise. Because generally speaking, malach is called avsha milsa. It has a certain public nature. It's like the water mill that keeps going around and making noise. So it could be that nobody has to know exactly how many hours I waited between meat and milk. That's not a public action, as opposed to our Mishnah, which is talking about malach. Now, this Mishnah is going to be very, very relevant when we discuss the issue, famous contemporary issue of travelers with regard to Yotav Sheni Shel Golis. And once again, that could go in 2 directions. You know, you could talk about a chutznik who shows up on Yontif in Eretz Yisrael. Again, they may not let him in these days, but if he can get here. And a Ben Eretz Yisrael who goes to Chutla. In the first case, he's taking with him his personal minhag l'chumra of Isa Malacha on Yontif Sheni. In the second case, he ends up in a location where the minhag is Yontif Sheni, they abstain from Malacha. And once again, it may depend whether it's Daito Lachzar, is he still connected to his original Makom? So that's the first part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah now offers a logical, a principle or a logical reasoning that underlies this halacha, that you have to pick up the chumrah that you don't have personally. It's not your minhag makom, but because you are located now on Erev Pesach in a place where they abstain from malacha, you too have to abstain from malacha. And that is val yishana adam mipnei hamachlokes. That if a person acts in a way that violates the local minhag, that's going to create machlokes. Now, if a person goes from a place where they don't do malacha on Erev Yontif, and he finds himself in a place where they do malacha, then this logic of al yishana b'nei machlokas doesn't seem to apply, because although he comes from a place where they don't do malacha and erev yontif, but now he finds himself in a place where they do malacha and erev yontif, does that mean that he has to do malacha, actively violate his minhag makom, his original minhag makom, in order to avoid machlokes? No. He can continue his minhag of abstaining from malacha from his makom, even though the minhag here is to go to work and do malacha. And that's called, in the language of the Mishnah, nosnu olav chumrei makom sheyatsa misham, that he has to continue his minhag elsewhere of Isur Malacha, even though here he's now located in a place where there is no minhag of Isur Malacha. And the question is going to be, why is that not a situation which will agitate people, which will incur and intensify machlokas? And once again, we might say that this is already something in his private life. You know, a person doesn't show up to work publicly for any number of reasons. And therefore, this doesn't have to be a matter of machlok. Kayotze bo, now the Mishnah goes on to discuss the mitzvah of Shvius, of Shemitah. And the Mishnah is going to take the original principles that we formulated here on Amud Aleph with regard to Holech Mimakom Lamakom Linyan Asiyas Malacha on Erev Pesach, and apply those principles to Peiros Shvius. Now, just by way of introduction to this part of the Mishnah, we have a mitzvah of biur. And biur means that at some point in the calendar, all food that grew during Shemitah has to be destroyed. And in the Parsha of Shemitah, at the end of Sefer Vayikra, Parshas Bahar, the Torah says, "Ulebehemtecha ulachaya asher b'artzecha tia kol tvuasa lecha," which means the following: that as long as there's enough food out in the field of that species of food, such that the animals can eat that food, then you likewise could eat the food of Shemitah. But the very moment kol lechaya b'sada, or kol behemtecha min asada, that there's no food out there in the sada to feed the animals, at that point in time, the Torah requires you to take all the food that was sanctified with Kedusha Shvius and burn it. Now, you may find that there's different locations. In certain locations, it's already called Kol L'chaya bin Asad, and there's no more food of that sort given the weather conditions in that location out in the sun. In other locations, that very same species might still be out there in the sun. So in the first location where there's kol l'chayim in a sada, you have to do biur. You're going to have to get rid of it. Whatever food of that same species is still in your house. But in the second case, since it's low kol l'chayim in a sada, we can continue eating the peros of Shvius even beyond that calendar date, because it's low kol in a sada, l'chayim in a sada. Now the issue is, if the mitzvah biur that requires me to take my shvius out of my house and destroy it it depends on location. What happens if I go from one location to the other? So let me just mention the Mishnah at the end of Shvius, in the ninth Perek of Shvius, says that in Eretz Yisrael, the land itself was divided into 3 districts. And each district has a different time zone, so to speak, a different cutoff point, at which, once we pass that cutoff point, the Bnei HaMakom, those who live in that area, are obligated to be mavayir the peros of Shvius. So it means that in other areas, 2 out of the other 3 areas, they are still eating those fruits of Shvius. You have, in that third area, have desisted from eating the fruits because it's already considered kol chayim and asad. Okay. So kayotze bo, the Mishnah says now here in Pesachim, that we have these principles of picking up the chumras makom shenichnas l'sham, and also carrying with you the chumras of makom sheyatsa misham, is hamolech peros shvius mi makom shekolu. Kolu means kolu l'chayim and asada, and l'makom shelo kolu, he comes to an area where the same species is still out there in the fields, and the animals are eating it. Oh, now we have the opposite scenario. Mimakom shelo kolu l'makom shekolu. And in all these cases, chayav levayir. So let's go through the 2 scenarios. In scenario number 1, they are chayav and beer in his location, but now he shows up in a place where they're still continuing to eat the peros of Shvius in the house. And they're not chayav and beer because it's lo kolu l'chayim and asada. And in the second case, he comes from an area where they're still eating the peros of Shvius. It's not yet kolu l'chayim and asad. Then he comes to a place where they have desisted. They have completely terminated their eating of the fruits because it's kolu l'chayim and asad. Our Mishnah Paskins that in both cases he's chayav and bir. In the case where he goes from makom shekolu l'makom shelo kolu, so there he's going to have to observe the local minhag and chayav levayir. In the reverse case, where he comes from a place where they are noeg, in other words, it's already kolu l'chayim and asad, the noeg already bir. Now he shows up with his fruits in a place where they're not noeg bir yet because it's lo kolu and asad. He's chayav in bir. Why? Because that's what they're doing in his local area where he was brought up, so to speak. Rav Yehuda Cholik. Rav Yehuda disagrees with Omer, and he says, "Say v'avelecha af ata." So Rav Yehuda says that if you take your peros, you're allowed to say to your friend, "Say v'ave." What does say v'avelecha af ata? It means that he's not chayav in bir, according to Rabbi Yehuda. And the case is that he comes from a place where lo kolu to a place where it's kolu, and now the people are, where in the local area where he shows up, people are destroying their peros shvius, taking him out of the bias. He can still say that I come from a place where local l'chaim min asod, and afata sevave, meaning you too can carry your peros to my location where it's local, and you can eat your peros there. There's no iser in transporting the peros from a place that's kolu. And it's not like a chova in the chefza that once the chefza was nitan lebir, then you're not allowed to eat it. You're allowed to take it to a place where local l'chaim min asod and eat it there. So as long, this is what the guy who's coming from a place where local, where there's no chiyuv bir, he says to uh, the local yokels, we'll call them, he says to them, look, you don't have to destroy your peros. Why don't you just bring your peros over to my area where our minig is that we don't destroy the peros because it's adayin, it's still not kol l'chayim and asod. And therefore, when I bring my peros to your area, you should allow me to continue my minog of eating these peros. We'll see a Mirza Shem in the Sugya about the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. All right, now we're going back to the Gemara is going to analyze the Resha of our Mishnah, the Isa Asiyas Malach on Erev Pesach, which up until Chatzos is Tolya Minog, but we were medayik in the Mishnah that from Chatzos and on, it's also Mikra Din. So the Gemara asks the following: are you telling me that dafka because it's Arvei Psachim, therefore there's a special din that you have a minog in the morning to abstain from malach? That's why the Mishnah singles out our Erev Psachim, as if to say there's no other day in the calendar, not on Erev Sukkot, not on Erev Shavuos, where we have a minhag to abstain from malach. Even on Erev Shabbos, we're going to abstain from malacha if there is such a minhag. This Sanya we learned in the Brisa also malacha b'Arvei Shabbosos v'Yomim Tovim min hamincha l'mayla eino roes simon bracha liola. If a person engages in malach on Erev Shabbos, Erev Yontif, don't think you're making you're making a lot of money because you're not going to get any benefit from it. So it means that we have to abstain from malacha not only on Erev Pesach, but even Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif. So why did the Tana say Makom SheNahagu lasas malacha bi'arvei psachim? Do you follow? The Gemara is claiming that the language of our Mishnah is misleading because it implies that we're allowed to do malacha on any other day of the year, Erev Shabbos, Erev Yontif. The only minhag lesser is only on Erev Pesach because that's what we saw in the Brisa in a row is Simon Bracha Liola. And the Brisa is talking not only about Erev Pesach, but even about Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif. So why did the Mishnah focus on Erev Pesach? The Mishnah should have pointed out that this is not only a problem on Erev Pesach, it's a problem on every Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif. The our Mishnah says, Makom SheNahagu lasas malacha bi'arvei psachim. Osim. No, that's not what it says. Let's read the Mishnah again. It says, Makom SheNahagu lasas malacha the arve psachim osim. Ah, I see. You see, the Gemara is putting its emphasis on ad chatzos. And the Mishnah is telling me that in the morning of Erev Pesach up to chatzos, there's a minhag to do malacha, and some place there's a minhag not to do malacha, implying that after chatzos, it's not dependent upon minhag. Why? Because it's Erev Pesach. And as we said in the name of the Yerushalmi, that's the time for the Korban Pesach. Forget it. That's not true. Every Erev Yontif, every Erev Shabbos is Asur b'Malach. In other words, basically, if the Mishnah would have crossed out the words Ad Chatzos, then we would have understood that Makom SheNahagu lasas malacha b'Erev Pesach means the morning of Chatzos, the morning of Erev Pesach Ad Chatzos. You didn't have to emphasize Ad Chatzos. When you emphasize Ad Chatzos, it sounds like you're telling me that Erev Pesach is divided up into two segments. There's the before Chatzos and the after Chatzos. And you present it as if that's the unique status of Erev Pesach, when that's not true. Because the distinction and the minhag of Isur Malach applies equally to Erev Pesach and all the other Yomim Tovim plus Erev Shabbos. So the Gemara answers, Hasam, there in the case of Shabbos and Yontif. There it's Mina Mincha Ulamala would be us. But Samach Lemincha Lo Hacha Mechatzos us. Why did the Mishnah emphasize Ad Chatzos? To teach you that on Erev Pesach, with Chatzos, you become Osam Malacha everywhere on the face of the earth. That's not totally a minhag. That's Mikra did. However, if you ask me at what time on Erev Pesach, on Erev Shabbos or on Erev Yontif am I required to abstain from malacha, there the answer is a different answer. It's not chatzos, it's samach lemincha. Now, what is samach lemincha? We take the afternoon and we divide it into two equal parts. And samach lemincha means, or shall we say, mina mincha l'mala means from 9.5 hours. That's when the Isur Malacha emerges. But Samach L'Mincha, in other words, earlier than that time, look, there's no Isur of Asiyas Malacha. But that's only as far as Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif. But Hacha and Erev Pesach, Mechatzos, it's Asur to engage in Malacha from Chatzos. So the Gemara asks, so the Gemara offers another possibility. So again, in the first possibility, what we're saying is that there's a fundamental difference between Erev Pesach, when the Isur Malacha is Chal for everyone, it's not totally minhag, from Chatzos, as opposed to Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif, where the Isur to engage in Malacha begins with Mina Mincha Lamal, which means from 9.5 hours until Shabbos, until Yom. But the second answer, the Gemara Nami, Hasam, there in the case of Malach on Erev Shabbos and Erev Yontif, that's really not considered an Isur if he does Malach. Because the Mishnah says, Eino roa simon bracha liolam. But when it says Eino roa simon bracha liolam, it means it's not really awesome. Just don't expect to gain from it. Amal shamuti lo meshamtinale. But he's not chayav for violating an iser chamur nidui. But hacha, if he engages in malacha on erev Pesach after chatzos shamute nami mishamtinale. He's even chayav nidui. He's violating on an iser derabanan, and that's chamur. That's very strict. So the reason why our Tana spells out the minhag ad chatzos, implying that from chatzos and on it's asur, he wants to teach you that now we're going to put you into nidui for violating that isur. And that's a specific and a unique halach to Erev Pesach, would not apply vis-a-vis Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom. Okay, what are we up to now? We're up to Gufa. And the Gemara now is going to quote a brisa as far as Simon Bracha is concerned. When are there times that you will not see Simon Bracha, you're not experiencing Simon Bracha from your Malacha? So let's make a note of it, that we're up to Gufa. Just wanted to add a note here. In the name of the Rimi Lunil, he writes that the Chovas Biur, the Ikar Adin, is rak bi ofen shekolu aperos gam b'makom shegodlu bo v'gam b'makom shenimtzoyim achshav. So that there's only a chiyuv bir if you have both conditions fulfilled, that it's kolu aperos in the place where it grew and in the place where it is now. And the chiyuv bir, in the case of chumrei makom, is in a situation where he's going from a place shekolu aperos l'makom shelo kolu. And there are Rishonim who say that li'olam ein lachshosh l'minog elek sheba lahosif al iser gomu. So that's something that in Mitzvah Hashem, we want to study in a little bit more in depth. Okay, then. So Blineda tomorrow will start with Gufa here on Daf Nun Amid Beis. Great day.